Want to learn how to take pictures like this? Or like this? Well, you're in luck, because that's what I'm here to teach you. Hi, I'm Maddie, coming from Immigration Creek, and I'm going to show you how to take some long exposure photographs. So let's break that down a little bit. First of all, long exposure, that just means how long the camera is recording the image for. And what constitutes a long exposure versus like a short exposure? So it's kind of subjective between photographers, but generally speaking, I like to define a long exposure as half a second or longer, and a short exposure as half a second or shorter. So just to give you a better idea of some examples of short versus long shutter speed, I have some examples. So this first one is a long exposure photograph of a waterfall. The exposure on this particular photo was 30 seconds, so it was pretty long. A classic characteristic of long exposure photography taken of water is the water being really smooth and silky looking. Another example of a long exposure is shooting stars to capture star trails. For this photo, I was shooting for about 2.5 hours and took a series of 30-second exposures and then stacked them in Photoshop. You can also use a setting on your camera called bulb mode, and that means you, the photographer, it tells the camera how long to keep the shutter open for. And instead of having to stack a few hundred individual photos, the star trails are captured in one frame. The next photo is an example of a short exposure. And this is a picture I took of a water balloon being popped, and it was taken at about 1/4000th of a second. Now I'm actually going to show you how to take the long exposure photograph. And when you're doing long exposures, or well, any photography in general, there are three big things that you really have to take into account. The shutter speed or exposure, the aperture, and the ISO. So the aperture is the whole, or the size of the opening in the camera that lets in the light. And then ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. So I'm only going to be dealing with shutter speed today, but whenever you're out just taking photos in general, those are three things you really do need to take into account. The number that's switching right now, that's the shutter speed. A little dash in the center, it means that I found an exposure that won't make the photo too light or too dark. Press the shutter, and then you wait for the camera to finish recording the image. You probably noticed that I was shooting on a tripod, and this is because when you're shooting a long exposure, you want the camera to be as steady as possible. So you can brace it, on a rock, or really brace yourself against a tree or something, but if you shake even a little bit, it really comes out in the image, and the image becomes really, really blurry. So the rule of thumb, whenever you're just out in general shooting pictures, 1/30th of a second is usually the slowest you can go before you need to start using a tripod. And anything above that, you're usually all set if you just have a steady hand. And that's the reason why when you're doing short exposures, hundredths of seconds or even thousands of seconds, you don't need that tripod, because the shutter is open for such a brief period of time that even if you shake a little bit, it's not going to record on the image. Alright, so we have our finished image, and as you can tell, you can see that the water is really smooth and silky, and that's, like I said, a characteristic of a long exposure. That's pretty much it for here. If you're curious to see what other photos I've done, any photography stuff, you're more than welcome to follow me on Instagram. My username is White Mountain Skier. It's also on the bottom of the screen. And that's it. I hope you learned something about long exposure photography, and I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.